Okay, excellent. Well, thank you, Rose. And thank you, everybody. As we've developed a sort of emergent practice of acknowledging country as we start, I'd like to continue with that practice and just really pay our respects to Gumbaynggirr people, past and present and emerging. And I have had a shorthand way of sort of acknowledging the tension, if you like, of working in the housing space around affordable housing and housing supply and the housing crisis that we're facing, and trying to find innovative solutions as a group of people who are, I think, all descended from white settlers who took up the land. And the shorthand that I've used in the past when I've acknowledged country is to say that sovereignty was never ceded. But what I actually mean by that is that there's this very interesting tension that we face doing this work on Gumbaynggirr country, where the land was taken up. And so there's some challenging things for us to think about and discuss and consider in that context. And I'm sure that we'll approach them during our strategic planning work that's coming up. But in the meantime, just want to take a moment to acknowledge Gumbaynggirr people and the country that we're all really blessed to be in. And welcome everybody and Kayla to our monthly Housing Action Group meeting. Kayla Clanchy, who's the Policy Officer with Shelter New South Wales, who I think is joining us from Orange. Is that right, Kayla?
Yes, yeah.
Which is great. So welcome, and thanks for making yourself available in the middle of floods and, you know, really what looks like is really unprecedented, you know, very challenging times in Western New South Wales at the moment. Kayla's talking about climate-ready housing and communities. And I went back to our constitution just a few minutes ago to remind myself of what we said when we workshopped our objects and guiding principles, because we deliberately as a group recognise the impact of climate change on housing and the need to have mitigating strategies and try and reduce the impact of climate change through housing. And I just wanted to read out that there's the object that speaks closest to this from our constitution is advocating for a range of innovative, environmentally responsible, affording and social housing solutions that respond to community needs. And then in our guiding principles, we said, we've got 5 or 6 guiding principles, but the one that applies, you know, specifically to sort of provide the scaffolding around your session, Kayla, is that well-designed and managed housing can positively contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies, and this should be encouraged given the climate emergency. And I think that, you know, we've all seen that emergency unfolding on speed really in the last few years. So it's really timely, and we're really pleased that you're able to join us on behalf of Shelter. And we're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So I'll just pass on to Rose, who'll give us a little bit more context, and then we're all ears.
Yep. Thank you, Kerry. I think you did a really fantastic job there, scene setting. So part of the reason why, hey Gabby, we wanted to invite Kayla along to join us today. Sorry, 1 minute. Was that, as I mentioned in the invite, a really key takeaway from our most recent needs mapping survey of the Shire was that respondents are already being impacted by the cumulative effects of natural disasters and a changing climate. And that's showing up in substandard housing, as well as issues around lack or under insurance, as households are finding it really hard to keep up. And a really early part of what brought us together as a group was an interest in land use planning as we all worked collaboratively to impact the development of our local housing strategy. And I think for most of us, we hadn't really interacted with the planning system much before then, but through that process, we all kind of became, you know, amateur experts in our own ways, and just how important, you know, the planning system is if we're talking about developing affordable and livable and environmentally friendly homes. So I think in continuation of that practice of ours of collective learning and trying to engage with really complicated big systems like the land planning system, we're really excited to have Kayla here, who is going to help us take a bit of a big step back and have a think in that sort of strategic way about where we grow, how we grow, what kind of housing we want, where do we want it, particularly in the context of the changing climate. So yeah, I'll just hand over to Kayla and say thank you so much for joining us. Kayla, take it away.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me to speak, and I really hope you all seem very engaged in the planning system and in housing matters generally. So I really hope that I can value add to what it is that your group's wanting to do. And I'll just start sharing my screen. All right, okay, I'm hoping you can see that. Yep.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, so first of all, I'm just carrying on that acknowledgement of country. I'm coming from Wiradjuri in the Central West in Orange, where just a week or so ago, we actually had our NAIDOC week celebrations because we celebrate it later in the year because of, you know, how notoriously difficult it is to organise people to be out and about in the middle of winter. And working in the housing and thinking about housing justice and climate justice, it really is, as Kerry was saying, speaking of, you know, sovereignty was never ceded. Well, how does that apply to matters of housing justice and all of that knowledge that we've potentially lost from First Nations groups through colonisation of land and that violence? So I think it's always really good to remember that at the start of every presentation. So yeah, I work with Shelter. Sorry, I'm just going to, oh, I've got something on my screen there. There we go. So Shelter's mostly concerned with advocating for different policies and practices that deliver housing justice for low-income households, public housing tenants, older women, First Nations groups, and other minority groups. And I myself am a renter living in Orange, as I said. I've been here since 2018, and before that I lived up in Armidale as a uni student. And my background is in town planning, so I used to work in local government as a town planner. So of course, coming to this topic from that macro level of strategic land use planning, proactive versus reactive policy, and individual versus community-wide resilience. So I'm also going to just be touching on some changes to the planning system recently, and we've had a flood inquiry report that was released in August this year. And I'm also going to, as Kerry and Rose were mentioning, talking about the insurance and underinsurance in the face of climate hazards. So I'll briefly touch on that as well. And the topic of climate-ready housing can be overwhelming in its breadth and depth. So I'll try and stick to my key topic areas, but of course, feel free to ask questions at the end. And if I can't answer them today, I will follow up with colleagues and other experts who can. Also, a disclaimer that this presentation is for general advice only. And although I've tried my best to ensure all information is accurate, nothing I say should be taken as ironclad when it comes to legislative interpretations. And I will also, I know that we've got a recording, but I'll also make sure that the slides get circulated separately, so you don't need to try and screenshot any of the slides as I'm going along. And also at the very end, I'll put together some calls of action. So hopefully you can have a look at some of these dot points and figure out what you would like to do locally and focus your attentions in the lead up to the state election in March next year. So kicking off, how are climate change considerations centred in the New South Wales planning framework? Well, they aren't, unfortunately. Climate change modelling is meant to be reflected in localised plans for flood risk and bushfire risk, for example, but these hazard maps and plans are fairly static, and the climate data inputs are not always downscaled, fine-grained spatial projections using the most up-to-date data modelled in collaboration with CSIRO. So when we think about flooding, for instance, the New South Wales Department of Planning recently released, as in July 2021 for local councils, a guideline called Considering Flooding in Land Use Planning. And although it's a recent update, it still references the Floodplain Manual 2005, and it reinforces the 1% AEP, so the 1 in 100 year flood probability event, plus freeboard as the acceptable flood planning level for most residential development. So that's to say new development should be located 500 mil above the 1% AEP, with little mandatory consideration for where the probable maximum flood event contour occurs. And the PMF can be anywhere from an equivalent 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 10 million year flood probability, depending on local conditions and dam failures. So the Floodplain Manual and EPA Act require flood modelling to be updated every 5 years and amendments added into local environmental plan 5-yearly reviews or sooner where major flooding has occurred and new evidence underpins the need for a new flood study. And there are sincere questions about whether this flood planning level of 1% AEP is dynamic enough and socially sustainable for new developments as anthropogenic warming drives more extreme weather events and events closer to the PMF level. So speaking of the PMF, the Department of Planning has recently created 2 optional clauses that I've got on screen here about flooding that can be added into LEPs. So we've got the Special Flood Consideration Clause and a dwelling or secondary dwelling affected by natural disaster clause. The Special Flood Consideration Clause, which can be added to LEPs for DA decision-making, empowers councils to consider more deeply flood risks and evacuation options for certain sensitive development located anywhere between the 1% AEP flood planning level and the PMF. So sensitive development in this context includes boarding houses, group homes and seniors housing, but not all residential development is considered sensitive. So non-sensitive development can still be captured by that clause where council considers land to be flood prone in such a way that it's a risk to life and evacuation logistics. By contrast, the second clause on the screen there allows like-for-like rebuilding of a dwelling house or secondary dwelling which was damaged or destroyed by a natural disaster in any circumstance where it was originally lawfully erected. So similarly, this clause can be optionally added into LEPs by councils, but there does not seem to be a specific requirement in that clause to consider the sustainability of rebuilding a residence in a location that's demonstrably prone to natural disasters. And the Planning Institute of Australia actually pointed out this contradiction during the flood inquiry earlier this year, and they recommend that second clause actually be pulled from circulation. So if there are local planning inadequacies or localised lags in accessing and incorporating climate change data and risk responsive planning, surely there are other stopgap measures at the state level in considering major developments and rezonings. You'd think so, but not necessarily. So there's an updated ministerial direction on flood planning, and that's the one I've got a portion of it on screen here. So councils must consider this ministerial direction, but like all ministerial directions, there are grounds for justifiable non-compliance when considering rezoning flood-prone land. And
just tell Kayla that we can't read the screen, so she can see that. So Kayla, just to interrupt just for a second, just so you know, we're viewing your presentation on a very big TV screen, but we can't actually read the clauses. Just so you know, we can't read you speaking to them like you are is fine. I just wanted you to know we can't read it.
I can't see the screen. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'll send around a PDF of the slides, and then that way, yeah, you'll have that on hand. You can actually zoom in a bit better and go over it if you'd like.
That's great.
Yeah, I'll try not to read off the slides, particularly if you can't see them. Yeah, so yeah, local councils in rezoning applications have this of minor significance get out of jail free cards, as so to speak, when it comes to planning proposals. But this minor significance justification, I've seen it be used in the case of spot rezonings that would marginally increase residential development on flood-prone land of an allotment or two. And it's this death by 1,000 cuts approach to cumulatively and holistically assessing the social and environmental risks of upzoning flood-prone land in like a patchwork way. I'm assuming this slide will be even fuzzier, but that's okay. It's just a list of agencies. It's a list of agencies that are referenced under the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act as referral agencies for major DAs. So, you know, ADAPT New South Wales is a government body tasked with ensuring various New South Wales agencies are climate ready and resilient, but it's not a referral agency for major developments or rezonings. And there are no referral agencies for DA or planning proposal approvals that specifically look at land development through the lens of worsening climate change. Bushfire-prone land and bushfire-prone development can be referred to RFS. They're one of the listed agencies. For some major developments or rezonings, but floodplain development does not routinely get referred to a specialist agency. Of the limited information we do have in the public domain at the moment about the to be created New South Wales Reconstruction Authority, I do not see how this authority will ever be able to meaningfully proactively engage with the development system in dealing with flood-prone land if it's not given this sort of concurrence authority as a listed agency under the Act. Just going to move on to some updates about basics. And we're seeing a move towards more emphasis being placed on individually resilient households in their built form with new national construction code standards on energy efficiency. And this is fine, but individualised built form responses alone are not going to produce climate ready neighbourhoods and communities. So in fact, the long drafted and controversially abandoned design and place SEP was meant to mandate that community-wide approach to climate resilience and planning. And many years of research and collaboration across industries, architects, urban design professionals and community groups went into creating that SEP, ensuring that all new subdivisions and residential developments would meet minimum estate-wide targets for accessibility and environmental outcomes. So master planning for greenfield areas in regional New South Wales was going to be included in the SEP, and this would ensure that developer by developer discretion in bending development control plan outcomes for maximum profit would be curtailed through the SEP, and particularly that integrity through an independent design panel as well. And that design panel could give advice on environmental outcomes to development proponents as well as assessing officers in local government. But it's been abandoned, that's it. So updates to basics, energy and thermal performance requirements, which were slated to be incorporated into the SEP, have continued on anyway and are being gradually introduced to the planning system from October 2023 onwards. All in all, changes to basics requirements are intended to support the state government's net zero emissions to 2050 strategy. And the key change to basics is the requirement for a 7-star NatHERS rating for new dwellings, instead of 6 stars. And this will need to be achieved through various design, materials, built forms and appliance mixes. Gas appliances and water heaters are still allowable under the new requirements. Curiously, the North Coast climate zones, including Bellingen, have been excluded from the updated basics requirements for performance of homes and apartment buildings up to 5 stories. Apparently, this is due to a cost-benefit analysis outcome showing the cost savings for homes in the North Coast climate zones were negative compared to everywhere else when modelling upgraded NatHERS ratings. I'm not privy to the details of the cost-benefit analysis or over what time period that savings versus costs were extrapolated out to, because I imagine in the long run scenario, the built form costs would eventually be outweighed by energy savings and overall social environmental benefits. Basics water saving requirements will be reviewed, upgraded, and introduced statewide by 2025. And as we all know, minimum standards for new builds is one thing, but what concerted efforts are there to ensure existing housing stock will meet some baseline energy and thermal performance standard, especially for rental properties and social housing? There is work underway apparently at the national level with a consortium of state energy ministers to create a national framework on minimum rental property standards for energy efficiency and built form. I think they might be a little bit behind schedule because we were meant to see the draft framework by mid-2022, but it's now getting towards the end of 2022. So we're just keeping an eye on that and wanting to ask Matt Keane, where is this draft framework and when will it be on track again? Changing gears a bit, an increasing area of concern, as you all mentioned, was under and uninsurance of homes and properties against climate change fueled disasters. So generally speaking, flood and bushfire prone locations are traditionally more affordable than other residential properties to buy or rent, due in part to perceived undesirable planning and building controls, as well as insurance policy hurdles. Simultaneously, many low and middle income households have dropped out of home and contents insurance during the first 2 years of COVID to save money. And the pandemic also encouraged a boom in sea and tree changes, and the property market heat in the past few years has really masked the climate insurance risk of a lot of these properties, with people buying properties in environments that they're unfamiliar with and homes that may not be insurable within 8 years' time. So that 8 years' time, 2030, that's this report from the Climate Council, and they modelled different scenarios as to uninsurability, and they came up with a scorecard of the top 20 most at-risk federal electorates to climate change-related uninsurability. And of all the properties classified as high risk by 2030, 80% of that risk is due to riverine flooding. And Bellingen LGA, as you might be able to see on screen, this LGA includes more than 40% of residential properties as medium to high risk and thus potentially underinsured or uninsurable by 2030. And the report presumes a high range emissions scenario to 2030, as most of the emissions and impacts that will be felt by 2030 are already locked in as of today. Which is not... Sorry, what was that?
Sorry, we were just saying, do we have that report? And I was like, yep, we've got it.
Yeah, I've got a resources list as well, and I've got it linked. Yeah.
Thank you, Kayla.
So sensible lending principles will also drive a further wedge in into wealth inequality, as high-risk properties will not be seen as financially viable investment options for banks to offer mortgages on. So there will inevitably be climate vulnerable neighbourhoods that either cannot be rebuilt due to insurance policies or cannot be exchanged in the private housing market due to banks undertaking their own credit risk analysis. And in that instance, government will need to intervene in some way or another to offer strategic managed retreat of these high-risk riverine, coastal and bushfire-prone locations, potentially funded through socialised insurance models. And there are many tiers to socialised or partially socialised insurance models. I don't profess to be an expert in this area, but the paper that I've shared on screen, and I've also got links to it, it does a really good summary of the different insurance philosophies, and it seems to settle, particularly when talking about climate change risk, on advocating for the fairness as social justice approach. And this approach to insurance recognises the accountability of government in action to date on climate change and the right for everyone to have a safe home. So limiting coverage to primary dwellings and non-vacant residential dwellings ensures priority cover is awarded to those who genuinely need it. And there's also examples that I've heard of mutual aid type home insurance schemes for community organisations and citizens. So for example, in the Philippines, in lieu of a centralised social insurance model, there exists a mutual aid membership network called CARD for rebuilding after typhoons. And this program, the members check in on each other after events, they distribute food and medicine, assist with lodging claims and applying for small loans. Which is just an alternative if your government is slacking a little bit. Now, the flood inquiry, it's the recommendations and the government response is quite a big topic, so I'll try and keep it brief. In late August, the inquiry released its recommendations, and this was obviously an inquiry set up as a result of the February and March flooding this year in the Northern Rivers and Hawkesbury Nepean. The initial terms of reference, which I have on screen for the inquiry, specifically referred to land use planning and management and building standards. In later versions of the terms of reference for the inquiry, however, this explicit reference to land use planning was removed. It's not known for certain why it was removed, but I suspect it was because of the compressed timeframe of the inquiry in hearing submissions and needing to report back by the middle of the year. And the planning and land use framework is very cumbersome and technically challenging, and it probably fell in the too hard basket as far as making actionable and well-received recommendations to government. Most telling for me personally was this snippet, and I'll read out the snippet from one of the hearings from the Deputy Secretary to the Department of Planning, Brett Whitworth, when asked about residences being built not to the 1 in 100 year flood level, but closer to the PMF as a precautionary approach. His reply was, planning to the PMF would just wipe out large amounts of people's values in their homes in places like Western Sydney. Setting the flood planning level to the PMF is a pretty blunt instrument. Now, this comment about impacts on home values as a consideration when altering planning controls is highly unusual, and having regard to market impacts on home values as a result of planning changes is not something I've ever been encouraged to do in my assessments as a town planner. Nonetheless, some land use planning related recommendations did come out of the inquiry, most notably about land swaps for severely flood affected land, temporary and long-term housing solutions, although there is no explicit reference to the role of public and social housing, and broader calls for better planning policies and reducing green and red tape, which is a curious recommendation when it comes to managing waterways. The government has since announced its response to the recommendation report, and I've linked them on the slide, but I'll just give you an idea of the overview. Broadly, all of these recommendations have been supported in principle, but I'm most struck by the apparent commitment to increase social and affordable housing in the government's response, but by what magnitude and in what flood affected areas is unknown. Also, there's an apparent commitment to adopt a risk-based approach to flood planning levels. So this tends to indicate moving away from a set and forget mentality of planning to the 1 in 100 year and not considering anything beyond that. But this is yet to be backed up by anything mandatory in the planning legislation. So we're also not particularly heartened by this. I've linked an action on screen there from the New South Wales Housing Strategy 2041, and it warns against sterilising land against residential development if it happens to be flood prone. So I feel like there probably is a cultural shift that needs to happen, that there is some land that is just not developable. And our friends at the Tenants Union, Vinnie's and other advocacy bodies have worked with UNSW City Futures Research Centre on their own report into the Northern Rivers flood response and recovery process. And they've identified where additional support is needed for chronic and acute housing. And I won't go through it because it's embargoed at the moment, but I'm just flagging that they've done their own work, and there's some really good high-level recommendations there. So I've included links to that as well. And this week as well, a bill has been debated in New South Wales Parliament on the creation of that statewide reconstruction authority to eventually absorb the Northern Rivers Reconstruction Corporation. But as I alluded to earlier in my presentation, I do not see this new Reconstruction Authority having specific ambit to influence strategic land use planning for climate hazards, despite it apparently being a proactive as well as reactive government agency promoting community resilience. And lastly, I know I've used a lot of examples and bits and pieces related specifically to flood planning, but in the moving feast of climate hazards and housing justice, it's too easy to forget just how dire things still are on the South Coast for many communities and families who've had to deal with the compounding events of the Black Summer bushfires, then COVID, then a material and supply chains crisis, then the domestic tourism boom with Airbnb, then more flooding. So as we head into our third consecutive La Nina event, there will be more flooding, devastation, and sitting here, I was telling Rose earlier that sitting here as I was getting this presentation ready throughout the week, hearing SES shoppers, you know, nearly constantly going to Molong and Eugowra and Cowra, like all of these places around me. So we're just going to see this ramp up in frequency and intensity. So then we do need to look forward, or not look forward as be happy about it, but project ourselves forward as to other hazards on the horizon. And that's the essence of what good planning does. We know prolonged drought years and El Nino seasons are coming. It's these compounding crises that will require a proactive government wholly concerned with establishing resilience at the macro regional level, right down to neighbourhood level, and then to individual buildings. And it's the intersection between climate and housing crises where we see the most enduring challenge for low-income households and the need for ambitious social housing, building and acquisition programs in safe localities as the ultimate safety net. This segues nicely to my last slide, where my first call to action is to stay tuned for Shelter's launch of our state election campaign asks, where we're asking, you know, for a real dramatic increase in the number of social housing dwellings being delivered by the new government or whatever government forms. So I won't read these all out now, but it's just something to mull over what you can do locally, what you can ask local councils, what you can ask your state MPs and election candidates. And yeah, I'll leave it at that because I've probably gone over my 20 minutes. But thank you all so much for listening.
Yay.
Thank you so much, Kayla. I just wanted to again apologise for the fact that we couldn't see your presentation on our end, but that we will link your PDF in our notes. And yeah, just thank you so much for all of that really considered information, particularly as you said, you've just been sitting there impacted by flooding in Western New South Wales. So thank you again. That must be very surreal to be living it and be writing about it at the same time.
Yeah, it was almost frustrating, you know, like we all know that this is an issue. We all know it's going to get worse. But I think, you know, the best antidote to that frustration is community organising, like what you're all doing. I think that's really great. And that's what motivated me to try and just block out what was going on around me and to just deliver this, hopefully deliver some information and some really practical ideas leading up to the state election of what you can do locally. Yeah.
Excellent. I'm just going to throw to Kerry now. Do you want to just ask?
Has Kayla, have you got time to answer questions and have a bit of discussion, Kayla?
Yeah, sure. Yep,
Yeah,
I'll give it a go.
Great, excellent, thank you. So are there any burning questions or comments?
Well,
Steph does.
I just wanted to sort of express my concern about this. Is it a relocation authority that the state government's setting up? Because it's supposedly operating in Lismore to help people who are in flood affected areas, you know, with buyouts and relocation and so on. Is this going to be working right across the central west of New South Wales now as well? You know, with the flooding that's happening out there, there's whole towns that are underwater. And how can that possibly work, that strategy? Those people would have to move out of the district virtually to get out of the flood levels. And that sort of links to this whole new concept about flood levels, you know, the 1 in 100. It just seems a bit bizarre because of clearly in Lismore, the flood levels greatly exceeded that, and it's happened several times over the last year almost. So that's my comment.
Yeah, so the Reconstruction Authority, I think part of their remit is, you know, managing these voluntary buybacks. So they've been very conscious to call it a voluntary buyback scheme or land swap scheme for the most severely flood affected residents, as you would know, around Lismore. I think Tweed has been operating a voluntary buyback scheme, Tweed Council, for a little while now, and it's been like on a rolling grants program with the state government. And so I think this idea of having a centralised state agency looking at not just the land swaps, but this Reconstruction Authority, yeah, I hear what you're saying, because Yagara has been wiped out. It's a very small village, but a lot of people there may not want to relocate. They may want to, you know, stay where they are. So it's not about forcing people to move. I think it has to be something that the community comes together and says, this is what we envision for our township. Like, this is where, you know, Lismore's had to have very difficult conversations about their main street. It can't be that fully top-down approach that you will relocate, but where there's the option to, and you'll get a better quality of life out of it and not having to be flooded on a more frequent and more intense basis. I think that that's definitely the role for government to play, to be that central, you know, manager, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
John?
I think there's a range of options. It's not only relocation. You can raise the building, hopefully out of flood reach. Is it going? If it's going to be extended, it needs additional budget. But also, you've got coastal erosion starting to impact severely several coastal communities, and we've also got coastal inundation to come. So it's an agency with an expanding role, that's for certain. So, you know, is there anything we need to do that can have an impact on how make in terms of suggestions or contributions to its development?
Yeah, well, I think that's why I flagged that there are these optional clauses that can go into LEPs around considering flooding, not just, you know, builds to 500 mil above the 1 in 100 year event, but what is the flood risk beyond that, right up to the PMF, right up to the probable maximum flood event. Because the best prevention for having to do these really traumatic relocations and land swaps is to not let people build there in the first instance. So with new developments and new estates, and particularly like you're saying, coastal erosion and these, you know, there's the coastal management plans and all of that sort of stuff. But again, I had a look at that today. The guidelines are guidelines. There's nothing mandatory about considering the projected, you know, beyond 10-year impact really of these developments. And so I think something that really needs to happen with new developments, new estates, new housing, is looking at that flood risk between the 1 in 100 and the PMF. And this is something that the Insurance Council of Australia and Flood Management Association, like, they're all saying that. And I think Insurance Council Australia are definitely saying that because they don't want to have to keep trying to insure properties that are going to get flooded time and time again. So I take your point, you can build up. There are many ways that you can engineer this, but it needs to be, it needs to actually be looked at above the flood planning level. And at the moment in planning, I've worked as a planner, as soon as someone's above that flood planning level, and if it's just a single detached house and it's above the flood planning level, assessment done. And I think that that mentality, that culture, it needs to shift, because there is significant risk between the flood planning level and the PMF, as we've seen in Eugowra, as we've seen in Lismore. Yeah.
Thanks.
Follow-up, is there any way in which our local council or our LGAs can liaise with the Insurance Council to find which areas are, as far as the insurers are concerned, are uninsurable or only insurable at excessive cost in their area of responsibility? Because if we can identify those areas, then that can influence policy within the LGA.
Yeah, that's a good point. I don't know how forthcoming the Insurance Council will be on sharing that information, but by all means ask. I mean, from what I've seen in the media and what I've seen in relation to the flood inquiry report and recommendations and going through the transcripts, like, the Insurance Council of Australia is quite staunch on this fact. So I think that they may receive communities coming to them and saying, hey, give us a bit more information so we can go to our local council and really push for this clause that they're going to have in an LEP, really consider that risk and what is that risk above the flood planning level. I think it's probably a good exercise to do, yeah.
Action plan.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Margaret. Thanks very much for your presentation. It raises me a fundamental sort of moral historical problem of when settlers first went into riverine flood areas, for example, Gundagai, they built a town in completely the wrong place. And the Aboriginal people said, no, go up the hill a bit. And of course, you know, there was a big flood, they went up the hill a bit. They have an advantage, there is a hill to go up. And so their roads and stuff are all elevated above the flood level. But in riverine areas and in coastal areas, what we butt up against is the philosophy that I can build anywhere. I'm empowered through my money, through my needing a house or needing a property. I can do whatever I like, and that philosophy of and I will make money from it. So you've got the three tranches of what you mentioned before about, you know, the consideration of how, you know, not allowing people to build an area will reduce the value of all the other houses. And then there's the psychology of most developers and politicians saying, I can build wherever I like. And you can come along with regulations. And what they haven't realised is what your presentation talks about, is that climate change has changed everything. You know, we can't just say, oh, well, it only happens once every 50 years. So I'll get 50 years in the house, we'll be right. No. We're going to have whole areas, and it's going to be a financial nightmare, not only that people can't reinsure, but how are we going to rebuild? How are people going to be able to afford to rebuild anywhere? So I think your presentation is the start, I think, of a conversation of how we have to approach this in a way that's quite robust and say that your thinking is short-sighted and it will not take us through the next 50 or 100 years. It will not.
Yeah, and that I really, if you have the time, encourage you to read the report that I linked in here about socialised insurance models, and it talks particularly about bushfire, but I think it's applicable to any sort of you know, natural disaster. And it sort of goes through that moral argument of ensuring people who have nowhere else to go have cover for their primary dwelling. But if you've got, what the moral argument, I suppose, of people who, with a lot of money, have bought nice coastal fronting properties and they expect to have a return, are they going to accept, in the case of, say, a land swap deal, are they going to accept what the market value of that at that time after a disaster will be? There will always be pressure from people who have this really vested interest in my land must return me money, even when it's not going to be worth much. So I think that the paper that I linked was really good in going through that. How do you make sure that a socialised insurance model doesn't get taken advantage of by people who are looking to just maximise their returns still on land? It needs to be some accountability for, if you've got a few holiday homes, they may not be worth much. Yeah, I take your point.
And Kayla, can I just, following on from that, can I just ask that I heard you right? Because I haven't read the report that Rose and Emma have got. Did you say that our shire is in the sort of cohort where more than 40% of our properties in 8 years' time would be uninsurable? Is that what you said?
Yeah, so the Climate Council 2030, and it's got that high range emissions scenario to 2030 to account for the fact that by 2030, the emissions today sort of lock in that impact in 10 years' time. And it's got Bellingen LGA. You can search by electorate, you can search by LGA. I did a search by Bellingen LGA, and yeah, 41% of residential properties are identified as medium to high risk, meaning medium to high risk of being either underinsured or uninsurable in 8 years' time. So that's, yeah, it's a pretty, I remember when that report came out, and I think it had the top 20 most affected electorates. And I think where my family live in the Maranoa electorate up in Queensland, it was like number 3 or something. And I was shocked. I was like, I have to tell my family, like, they've got 8 years to prepare. Yeah, it's mind-boggling. But I mean, I then also had a look. CoreLogic released their own coastal. It's like called a coastal valuations index. And I looked at the suburbs, and they line up across the Climate Council report and this CoreLogic report from earlier this year. I'm like, why is this not front page news everywhere?
That's really helpful. I can feel a joint project coming on between the Housing Matters Action Group and the Neighbourhood Care Network myself, which is focusing on disaster preparedness and recovery.
They're so linked, aren't they?
They're so linked. I mean, I'm facilitating a disaster preparedness public meeting in Runga on Sunday. And I'm going through my head thinking, wow, if I said this at that meeting, people would be so freaked.
Be a panic.
They'd
Absolutely.
They'd go home without eating sausages.
I know.
Any other questions from anyone? Sorry, Jen.
Last call, comments, questions?
I just had one really quick one. I think I heard you say that there was this kind of attempt, I think you said it was the design and place set, to get some sort of community-wide, neighbourhood-wide, really strategic approach to these kinds of issues, but that was killed off, and in place of it, we've got much more of this sort of household level attempt to manage these issues. And I can see, even though it's absolutely tiny type, that in your call to action, you have referenced trying to resurrect the design and place step. And so that's maybe something that our group can get our head around and try and understand, the value of that step. And I was just curious if you could just maybe give me a bit of an idea of the process around it being sidelined. Why was it, and what was some of the forces in action there?
Well, so Rob Stokes, when he was Minister for Planning, this was very much his baby, design and place. And I have to be careful because I know this is being recorded. But when Minister Anthony Roberts came in as the Minister for Planning and Homes, I think it was within a few weeks of him coming in, he announced at a developers luncheon that the design and place SEP would not be being pursued by government. You could imagine that high requirements for developers to take this more strategic approach to estate developments and urban design generally, there was a lot of pushback by certain lobbyists, and they eventually got what they wanted, which was the design and place SEP has been shelved. Some of the stuff associated with individual households, so basics updates, is going ahead. But like I said, individual in the face of the climate crisis is not going to cut it.
Yeah.
So it's something that we call for in our submissions when we're talking to other community groups. It's keep talking about the design and place SEP. I think, you know, Minister Roberts probably wants us all to forget about it. But if we don't forget about it, and if we keep asking for it to be instated, hopefully we can get it back up and enforced.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Kayla.
True.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Just one last little round of applause.
Yay.
Thank you for having me. This has been very, like I said, very surreal doing it this week with everything that's going on, but I'm glad that I was able to, provide something hopefully useful for you. And Rose, I'll send you a copy of this, the slides and all of the resources and everything for you all to look at when you get the chance.
Great. Much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Still got Vanessa there.
Yeah.
Recording.